There is a storage unit on Route 19 in Bethel Park, Pennsylvania, that costs my neighbor Gerald $214 a month. He has been paying $214 a month since October of 2007. That is 17 years. That is $43,656 in storage fees for a unit that contains, by Gerald's own account, nothing he has looked at since the second year he rented it. I calculated that number on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2023. Gerald was standing in my kitchen. I wrote it on a piece of paper and slid it across the counter to him. He looked at it for about 4 seconds, then he said, "I know." He already knew. That is the thing about the items on this list. Most people already know. The knowing is not the problem. The problem is a category of thing that has been in a person's possession long enough that getting rid of it starts to feel like a decision about identity rather than a decision about storage. And once it becomes about identity, the $214 a month starts to feel like a reasonable fee for not having to decide. I am 81 years old. I spent 34 years as a municipal accountant in Pittsburgh. I noted patterns in other people's financial behavior for 3.5 decades, and what I observed was consistent enough that I will stake this on it. Every person watching this is paying some version of Gerald's $214 a month. Not necessarily in money, sometimes in something that costs more. I watched 3 people go through retirement with the wrong inventory. I was the 4th. I'll tell you about all of them. The journalist who drove out to Raymond Zemansky's house in Mount Lebanon on a Thursday in November 2024 noted a legal pad on the kitchen table with 2 columns of figures, neither labeled. Raymond did not explain them. He set a pen down beside the pad, watched it roll a ½ inch, and began talking. The first person I observed was a man named Frank Kowalczyk. He worked in the infrastructure division of the city, roads and bridges, and he retired in 1999, 3 years before I did. Frank was 62 when he retired. He owned, at the point of retirement, the following relevant items: a 1987 pickup truck he hadn't driven since 1995, a full workshop in his garage containing tools for a woodworking business he'd run on weekends in the 1980s and discontinued in 1993, and 11 years of trade publications for a certification he no longer held. None of these things were expensive to keep. The truck sat. The tools sat. The publications sat in 4 cardboard boxes along the garage wall. What I observed in Frank over the first 3 years of his retirement was a consistent pattern. He organized around these things rather than moving past them. He spent an entire summer of 2001 cleaning and reorganizing the workshop, instead of deciding whether to sell the equipment. He had the truck inspected twice, $340 total, without ever driving it. He told me in the spring of 2002 that he was getting to sorting the publications. Frank died in 2006 at 69. The workshop sold as a lot for $1,800. The truck went for $400. The publications went to the curb. What I concluded from Frank was not about the objects. The objects were fine. What I concluded was that a man who has no structure provided to him by employment will construct structure out of whatever materials are available. And if the available materials are unfinished tasks from a previous life, he will spend the first years of retirement managing the remnants of a version of himself that no longer exists, rather than figuring out who he is now. The items you carry into retirement do not sit quietly. They ask questions. Frank spent 7 years answering questions from a workshop that belonged to a man he'd been in 1988. Some of you have a Frank situation in your garage right now. A workshop for a business you stopped running. Equipment for a hobby that ended. A truck for a version of your life that drove away. The question is not whether to sell it. The question is whether you know what you're actually holding on to when you keep it. The second person I observed was a woman named Patricia Hess. She worked in city legal, paralegal, 28 years. She retired in 2004, 2 years after I did. Patricia's inventory problem was not physical. This is the part most people don't anticipate when they hear a list like this one. Patricia had held a senior paralegal role for the last 11 years of her career. She had a title on her door and a budget line for her department and 3 junior staff who reported to her. She had business cards that said, Senior Paralegal, City of Pittsburgh Law Department. She kept 400 of those business cards in a box after she retired. I know the number because she told me. She said she didn't know what to do with them. Couldn't throw them away. The title on them felt like, and here I'm going from what she said, not what I concluded. It felt like the last official record that she had been that person. What I observed in Patricia over the first 18 months of her retirement was that she introduced herself in social situations by referencing her former role approximately 70% of the time, by my count across 9 separate observations. Not boastfully, almost reflexively, like a man who reaches for his wallet and finds it in a pocket he hasn't worn in 2 years. The business cards were not the problem. The business cards were the symptom. The problem was that Patricia had not separated her identity from her employment before she stopped being employed. The cards, the title references, the organizational habit of positioning herself relative to a role, all of it was inventory from a job that had ended, and she was carrying it into rooms where it no longer applied, and wondering why the rooms felt wrong. She sold the cards, recycled them, technically, in 2006. She told me afterward that it took her 45 minutes to do it, and she sat in her car for 12 minutes after. I am not presenting Patricia's situation as a failure. What I am documenting is this. The items on this list are not all in your garage. Some of them are in how you describe yourself to strangers. Some of them are in the mental categories you use to assess your own worth. And those items are harder to sell than a truck. You are watching this and you already know what your version of those business cards is. You know exactly what it is. The title you still use in conversation that no longer applies. The professional affiliation you keep renewing past the point of any practical use. The email signature you haven't updated in 3 years because updating it would mean admitting something. I'm not telling you to get rid of it tomorrow. I am telling you that every month you keep it, you are paying a fee. It is not $214, but it is a fee. Now I have to tell you about the third person. This one is the unexpected one, because the third person is not a cautionary example. Her name was Dolores Martinelli. She worked city parks and recreation for 26 years and retired in 2000 at 58. I did not know Dolores well. We were acquaintances through a mutual retirees lunch that met monthly at a diner in Carnegie. At her first lunch after retiring, she brought a list, an actual handwritten list. I noted it because I am a man who makes lists, and I noticed hers across the table. 2 columns, one with items, one with what appeared to be disposal methods. I asked about it. She showed me without any particular ceremony. It was 14 items. A car she no longer needed since her husband drove. A season pass to a theater company she'd attended out of obligation since the mid-1990s. A gym membership she'd kept since 1997 and used 11 times. Subscriptions. A part-time bookkeeping job she'd been doing since 2001 for a former colleague, which paid $380 a month and consumed 1 full day of her week for work she no longer found useful. Professional memberships in 2 organizations she had joined because her supervisor had joined them. She had done her inventory before retirement, not after. She sold or canceled every item on the list within 90 days of retiring. The bookkeeping job alone returned 1 full day per week to her life. She calculated 52 days per year, which over the next 10 years came to 520 days. She wrote that number on the list. What I concluded from Dolores was that the inventory problem is solvable. It requires only 2 things that most people never do simultaneously: an honest count of what you're carrying, and a willingness to price each item at what it actually costs, rather than what you paid for it originally. The original price is not what something is worth now. An accountant knows this. Most people forget it when the asset in question is part of their routine or their identity. My right hand has a slight tremor since I was 76. I set the pen down and it rolls a half-inch and I note it, and I pick the pen back up. I retired in 2002. My inventory problem was not a workshop or business cards. Mine was a specific category of professional grievance. The 3 promotions I had not received. The documentation I had kept across 12 years that demonstrated what I concluded was a pattern of institutional bias in the promotions process. Binders. Actual physical binders with dates, names, comparative performance records, emails I had printed. 4 binders. I brought them home in a box when I retired. I put them in the office. I kept them for 6 years. In 2008, I was 65 years old, and I took the binders out, and I read through them over 2 evenings. What I observed was this. The documentation was accurate. The pattern was real. The conclusions were defensible, and I had been storing a 12-year argument against an institution I no longer worked for, against people who had mostly retired themselves, in 4 binders in my house in Mount Lebanon, and the binders were not doing anything except confirming a correct conclusion to an audience of 1. I shredded them on a Saturday morning. Took 40 minutes. I did not feel lighter. That is what people say. You feel lighter. I did not. I noted an absence of something, and then I had lunch, and the afternoon was the same as any other afternoon. But the shelf was clear. And I noticed, over the following months, that I had stopped pricing my current days by what the institution had cost me in the past. The binders had been doing that work quietly every time I walked past the shelf, keeping the account open. You're allowed to close an account, even if you were right, even if every entry in the ledger is correct, even if the institution that wronged you is still operating and has never acknowledged it. You are allowed to close the account and stop paying the carrying cost. Here is what the 4 of us, Frank, Patricia, Dolores, and myself, had in common. And it is the thing this list is actually about. Every item on a genuine retirement inventory falls into one of 2 categories. The first category is things that belong to a past version of you, a version defined by roles, routines, grievances, or ambitions that the retirement date made obsolete. The second category is things you are keeping because getting rid of them requires you to make a statement about who you are now, and you haven't made that statement yet. Dolores sold her list in 90 days because she had already made the statement. She knew who she was without the items. The rest of us took years longer because we were still using our inventories to postpone the question. The 12 things you need to sell before you retire. And I use sell loosely, because some of them you cancel, some you shred, some you simply stop saying out loud. The 12 things are whatever is currently serving as your answer to that question. You already know what they are. I have a pen on this table. My hand sets it down and it rolls a half-inch. Count your binders. Then decide what an open account costs you per month and whether the number makes any sense at all.